Thank you, our student department, and the gathering here. I can see many of my colleagues, many of my students here. Now, obviously, it is a great moment, an auspicious moment for all of us, because we are celebrating 100 years of Department of History and also of the university. So, and of course, I would begin with one of the paintings, because we are overwhelmed by so many art historians here. And I, not being art historian, but I still tried to use a painting of 19th century to begin my story. So you can see the two photographs here. One is from 1864 and the other is from 1876. Now these are two similar photographs of the coastal Calcutta. But the difference that you can see in these two photographs is that the first one is actually about the massive destruction that the storms have created on the coast of Calcutta, and the other one has ships where the masts have been removed. Now, when I was doing my own research on early modern period, and as she mentioned about the anomalies that I'm actually working on, the anomalies of the 17th century. Now, I came across one of the references of cyclones in Ainetbury. And then Ainetbury mentions that, there was a massive cyclone was used at that time. So there is a reference that there has been a massive storm which came in the year 1574. And then after that storm, there was massive, population which was affected, although it doesn't talk about the deaths. Now, there is a very interesting mention by Abul Fazl that, there is a local ruler who actually, when he heard about the cyclone coming, he then climbed up to a higher platform. And he went up to a temple which was located on high elevation. And that's how he saved himself. Now, I wanted to actually link these three aspects when I was weaving this story of cyclone and weather. So that's the beginning of what I actually wanted to tell you. Now, weather observation. Many of us know that weather observation has been, it's now very common. We have many models which are developed related to weather, and what you see on your, on your mobiles every day, that what's going to be the temperature, it's actually based on the models, right? So here, these weather observations actually started in 18th century, and then I'm talking about the modern weather observations. And then in the 19th century, these weather observations then became meteorological observations. Now, there is a history to this transition from weather observation, normal weather observation, to meteorological observation, because in 1875 you have the Indian Meteorological Department being created in India. Now, most of the early indigenous climate-related observations were, they were addressed to the prediction of monsoon, and many of us know, and one of the very beautifully written recent book, Climate of Conquest, actually talks about, how the monsoons were being studied, because the monsoons actually told the rulers when to invade the territories. Now, monsoons were actually part of the study of the rulers even in early modern times. And historically speaking, the 17th century was an incredibly very productive century, I would say. Because the Mughals, on one hand, they were fighting for the dominance of the mainland India under Shah Jahan and Aurangzeb. The European commercial enterprises were lurking in the Indian Ocean. And they were taking advantage of the trade winds and then coming to the coast of India. So when we examine the 17th century, there is a striking fit between the predominant winds and the shape and the scope of the Dutch, French, and the British colonization in South and Southeast Asia. And this is evident when we superimpose a map. How do I go to the second slide? Right. So, in fact, when we superimpose these earlier trade wind maps on modern maps, we could see that all these locations are the areas which became the early colonies of these Europeans. They are basically based on the trade winds. Now, the first one is actually Edmund Halley's 17th century trade wind chart, which he prepared of the world. Now, at the turn of the 18th century, as the movement of the British ships in the Indian Ocean became very frequent, the study of sea wind and its behavior became a popular subject of inquiry. It was impossible for the ships during those years to sail against the wind during the age, because that is actually known as the age of sail. And from November to April, the mariners traveled from India towards south, and they actually crossed Africa to reach Europe. They exploited the monsoon winds from May to October to maneuver their ships towards India. But one of the common threats for all these sailing ships was the occurrence of the tropical storms. Next slide. Yes. Now, the Bay of Bengal actually has been the most vulnerable zone because of the frequent occurrence of tropical cyclones. And in fact, it is one of the primary tropical cyclone basins with an annual average of 5 to 6 tropical storms. There are, of course, two cyclone seasons, one which actually comes just before the monsoon, and that is in April and May, and the other one is the months of October and November. Now, both these cyclone period, the cyclone months, are actually, very. These cyclone months are well known to the coastal communities of India, and they are prepared for all these cyclones. Cyclones would come. They know this, and they are already prepared for this. Now, the ones that we hear today are actually the massive ones, because it's actually about the distance that these storms cover in the sea, which increases the intensity of those storms, and which then touches the coastal area. So, the ones that we don't hear about are, because every year we have 5, 6 of them, but the ones that we don't hear about is actually the ones that are going directly toward the northwest. And that's why we don't hear about them. But the ones which come after, sometimes after decades, they are the most, ferocious ones, because they travel, they take a, kind of a recurving, we call it recurving. So it takes a recurve and then enters into Bengal. And that's the most destructive cyclone. It is this cyclone possibly, which Abul Fazl mentions in Ain-e-Akbari, and when he's talking about the Bengal region. Now, the cyclone, this Abul Fazl's, the mention that Abul Fazl actually is making in Ain-e-Akbari is, there is not much description about it. It just gives a passing reference when he's talking about, one of the rulers of Bengal. But then we have a very interesting account, a historical document from 18th century. From 1737, we have another very destructive cyclone which has come. But then it has destroyed the ships, because the cyclone that we hear about of 1737 is actually a record which has been kept by the Europeans. And it mentions that there were many Dutch ships which were destroyed by this 1737 cyclone. Now the next two cyclone that actually is part of my story is the dreadful ones of 1864 and the 1876, about the photographs of which I shown in the beginning. 1864 cyclone was dreadful, and there has been a massive reporting. You have very detailed record which was published by the British government after 1864, and the reason was very simple. The reason was that it destroyed the property of Calcutta, it destroyed many of the buildings of Calcutta, it destroyed many of the vernacular literatures which were kept in the offices of Calcutta, and it destroyed many of the ships that were, docked in Calcutta or which were traveling in the sea during that period. Now, this cyclone of 1864 came without any warning, because they don't have any warning system, they don't have any models which could predict the cyclone during those years. Now, this is, this description, this report, detailed report of 1864, actually then pushes me to, investigate few of the questions. And I argue here in my, paper, which SEMA promises to publish later on. You can read that in very well in the detail at that time. So I argue in that paper that the nature of the devastation caused by this 1864 cyclone was the prime reason behind the accelerated meteorological study that we witnessed in the later half of the 19th century. And it is only after the 1864 cyclone and the event of cyclone that the colonial scientists in Asia became eager to establish meteorological stations. Now this cyclone of 1864 actually forced the British observers to think in terms of weather forecasting, so that they were in a position to send the warning of an imminent storm. But did this early warning actually help the communities? Now that's the question that I wanted to investigate. And this is the main part of my story that I have. Now obviously we don't have much time about it, but very briefly I'll just tell you what exactly my story actually includes. There are a few slides I'd like to show. The next one, please, slide 5. So just before that, yes. Now these are the two of the observation-based monsoon maps prepared in the early 19th century. The one is from 1801 and the other one from 1855. These were the maps of the trade winds. It was about how monsoon can be used for sailing the ships towards Asia and other Indian Ocean regions. The next slide is about American navigator. He prepared a very detailed map of the world, and his name was Matthew Fontaine Maury. And this is 1860 map. In fact, this guy was hired by the British East India Company to prepare a map for them, so that his knowledge, his map could then help the British East India Company to sail the ships at a lesser cost. Now, what he identifies through this map is that there are months from May to September, which are actually the months when the ships can actually use the winds to sail, and then this will reduce the cost of sailing. Taking the goods to different destinations. So this map, Morris map, was used by them during that time after 1860 onwards. Then during that time there were many observation stations, meteorological observation stations, which established in Madras, Bombay, Calcutta, Shimla, and Trivandrum. And these observatories were also intended to understand the weather patterns in India. So the government at that time was more concerned about, unraveling the mystery of the storms in the Indian Ocean, where, most of the trading activities actually were taking place. Now, one of the important personalities of the time was Henry Paddington, who began recording the ocean storms in the Indian Ocean during those years. And then he was the one who coined the term cyclone. So the term cyclone was actually not used earlier. So he was the one, So he was the one who actually then wrote a book, a very famous book called Sailor's Handbook of Storms. And then in that book only, he recommended that, it is very essential that we should have information from various meteorological observations stations to, do some kind of meteorological modeling. But then it could not these observation stations could not provide much information because they were not very trained people who were recording these things. Because one of the documents of the 1860s suggests that there were, at that time, just because they were not trained people, two army men from each of the stations were picked up to collect all the data and information about various rainfalls, temperatures, and things like that. And these were then to be provided. So basically, they were not trained people, and they did not understand the seriousness of these, data collection at that time. And that's how it could not help the the meteorological modeling. And then immediately after the publication of, within few years after the publication of this Paddington's book, you have a cyclone coming in, 1864 one, which struck Calcutta, and then it affected in two ways. Number one, that it affected the urban population of Calcutta, and secondly, as I mentioned, that it wrecked many of the ships which were docked there, or there were many ships which were traveling. So we have a data, very interesting data from those years, which suggests that almost more than 1,000 ships which were destroyed. And mind you, ships during those days were quite a costly affairs. Constructing those ships, big ships during those years were quite expensive. So the destruction of the ships during those days was an important anxiety for the British, at that time. And that's how they, after this, they appointed, the next slide please, Henry Brentford. After 1864, he was appointed as the meteorological reporter to suggest what the wind currents vortex is. Vortex is from where the current originates. And it was then Brentford on the base, he collected information from different ships which were traveling during those days, a day before 1864 cyclone came. So he collected all the data. All the ships during those days were, maintaining logbooks. And we now, while we write environmental histories, have been using those logbooks which are well preserved. I'm surprised that the historians have not been able to use those logbooks which are so very rich in the 17th and 18th century. So those logbooks and the information in those logbooks he used, and then on the basis of that he concluded that these tropical cyclones actually originated very much parallel to the Andaman Island. I have mentioned that elsewhere in one of the articles that I published in Global Environment, where I mentioned about the British anxiety, why Andaman Island was where the flag posts were established by the British when they are faced with these challenges. I mean, these new informations are coming in about the Andaman Island and the origin of the cyclones in those areas. Even after Blandford's, because Blandford's information was quite accurate, there was a cyclone which was coming in 1876, and just before the 1876 cyclone, on the basis of the information that he had gathered and the models that he had been able to create, Blandford was able to forecast that there is a cyclone coming in very soon in 1876. So all the bus, the photographs you remember I showed earlier, where the masts have been removed from the ships. Now this was because these early warnings then told you that you should remove the mast, because if there is a storm coming in, it will not wreck the ships. So that's how the ships were saved. But my question was that did it actually save the communities? So the communities, the coastal communities who were living in Calcutta, they were affected. But apart from that, there were communities which were living in the Sundarban area who were massively affected by the 1876 cyclone. So, this 1876 cyclone, why I'm saying that it has affected a huge population, because we have figures. Although the reporting of 1864 is much more extensive, the reporting of 1876 cyclone, although the mortality is much more, has not been reported so much in the British accounts. And that actually has helped me to enter into this, the investigation as to why this happened and how it has affected 1876 cyclone has affected the communities at large. Now, it so happened that the British government at that time was trying to allot lands, and I have published one of the papers about the Alluvium and Diluvium Act of 1825. Now, this Alluvium and Diluvium Act was then implemented very swiftly in Sundarban area. New lands were being allotted because the British government wanted to generate revenue. So, yeah, I'm just going to conclude very quickly. Right. Now, while I was doing all this, I will just conclude that why the communities, or for that matter, Abul Fazl doesn't mention about the death and the mortality due to the massive cyclone, or even the later accounts do not mention about the deaths. Even 1737 one, or the one that came in 1864, it did not lead to deaths in the Sundarban area. The reason was simple, because people were not settled in those areas at that time. The reason was that the communities had their own traditional way of understanding the cyclone. They have their own ways of, knowing that the cyclone is coming. So we have, accounts of dogs howling, leaves of the silk cotton trees turning upside down, ants moving to the higher grounds, roaring sound coming from the Bay of Bengal 2 days ago. And then the birds tended to fly closer to the ground, ripening and early rotting of fruits and unusual flowering of plants. I mean, these are few of the observations that were quite useful for the local communities that they often use. But then you have, the Sundarban area, which has been newly settled because the British government wanted to collect revenue from those areas. They settled them, but then they were vulnerable people. Now, I just want to conclude with a very interesting, terminology which has been used by Greg Bancroft, who says that there was some kind of tropical otherness which was created during those years. Now, was this was this, massive reporting of 1864 actually created because they wanted to create the tropical otherness. Was it because, the British government wanted to say that, these tropical cyclones are different, and these are, this is a different environment where you have the cyclones coming in. So they wanted to create some kind of a fear and then come with solutions. Now, this is, but then at the same time, they were not doing anything for the communities. So you create an otherness, you create a tropical otherness, create a fear, and then you don't do anything for the community. So you save the ships, you save your own properties with this kind of a forecasting, with this kind of a modeling, but the communities at large have not been saved. Right. We can take up questions. When we discuss more issues would come.